This is Gabe Nedwick with my Week 2 discussion for MPA 545 Conflict Resolution for California Baptist University for Professor Curtis's class. So one of the first ideas that I looked at from our textbook was Bazerman's and Neal's idea of the mythical fixed pi, which relates back to the distributive negotiation, which basically states that there's like a certain amount or a finite set of resources that everybody must compete for. So instead of it's a win-lose situation. People are trying to get the most of what's available that they can. So again, if you're looking at the fixed pi, there's only obviously so much pi. And yeah, but in Bazerman and Neal's book, Negotiating Rationally, they also talk about negotiation. It's more like, if you look at it as a creative problem-solving idea, the idea is to try to connect the dots, and in the book they actually do have connect the dots in there. To connect dots, people should not just assume that there's a fixed pi, but they should look for trade-offs. So you should be more creative, like the example of the apple from our textbook about, or the videos, I guess was, where if somebody just needs the apple to eat and somebody needs the apple seeds, you can look for creative ways to solve those problems. So in Negotiating Rationally, they're I guess arguing more for not just the distributive negotiation, but again looking for kind of that creative way to solve the problems. One of the other theories or concepts that was discussed in our textbook was by Stafford and Daly about the conversational memory, and it was in the Sources of Conflict section. And in the book they actually say that there's a difference between actual and perceived conflict, and most people can only recall like 9%. Their book or their article actually says 10%, but the textbook says 9% of what they went over or talked about a few days before. And in their article or their book here, with the incredibly long, not very easy to remember title at the bottom, I found it interesting that they actually go over a study that it was done in 2 stages, where they do a 7-minute conversation with the group of people, and then after that they actually have what they called a short distraction film, and then after that the participants try to recall some of the information from the conversation, either orally or written down, and then some of that group they actually called back later on to go over some of that conversation like 4 weeks later, just again to prove how people don't always remember things. So if you're going over, if there's a conflict or something like that, it's not always what was actually said, but you might actually be thinking you remember things a different way from what it actually was. So just an interesting little study and fact about negotiations and conflicts. Another interesting one that was mentioned in the book was by Keltner, and it's about how during negotiations people try and they kind of enter into this antagonistic behavior phase, and that's more to protect their image than things like that. And the author Keltner here in his article about mediation, they actually say that using a mediator is actually a great way to help negotiators save face, because if people are going through mediation, or if there's a conflict, if it's just the 2 parties who are discussing things back and forth, they're going to kind of enter this face-saving phase where it's not going to be a normal conversation back and forth. It's always going to be more competitive And when it gets to that competitive phase, people are going to try and again look their best, do their best, and it could just enter into excuse me, a negative aspect of the negotiation. So that's why you would need a mediator in things like this. So one of the other things that we talked about or was mentioned in the textbook is Northrup's ideas of the frozen conflicts, as he calls them. And he talks about 4 stages that lead to the so-called frozen conflicts. And the first is that there's a sense of threat. So depending on what the negotiation is or the conflict, going into what can feel like a high stakes negotiation, there's a sense of threat that one side needs to win, and if you've got this idea of this distributive piece of the pie type idea, you have this threat that you want to get the most you can out of the negotiation, which leads then to the distortion of the other position. So you're already not looking at the conflict or the situation rationally, and then that leads to a hardening of the positions, which at that point you're already pretty much all the way in this frozen conflict. And the final stage is that there's a fixed pattern of responses, and at that point it's just nobody's going to budge at that point. So looking at Northrup's article about the dynamic identity in personal and social conflict, which is actually a chapter in the book at the bottom, but he talks about the assumptions in the field of conflict theory. And again, he apparently likes groups of 4, but the 4 assumptions that they talk about in this field of conflict theory, which I found very interesting, were that the parties are able to they have to be able to handle and resolve conflicts. So if you have 2 parties that aren't even able to handle or resolve conflicts at all, they're not going to be able to they're not going to be able to move past that. The second one is that the central factor is clearing misperceptions. So again, going back to the frozen conflicts, when you get to the hardening of the positions, you need to be able to basically not get to that phase. You can't harden the position. You have to be able to listen to the other side to agree on something. The third phase of conflict theory is that the principles are assumed to work in different settings. So it's not just that some of these theories are only going to work in like international law or business law. The basic theory should work anywhere, and that the ultimate value is peaceful resolution. So the idea of conflict theory is just that you should never get to a frozen conflict, which is what Northrop is saying. So yeah, those are the 4 things I found interesting in the chapters in our textbook so far, and going back to what the authors said in their own writings. So thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great week.